It's no secret that divorce can easily turn ugly. Feelings are involved. Typically, one partner doesn't want the divorce. Sometimes there's betrayal involved, and one partner is left feeling bitter and vengeful, especially if the other partner has moved on rather quickly. This is the story of Alan Bates, a father that faced a brutal death, all because he wanted to be in his daughters' lives. Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. It's so greatly appreciated. Truly is. Before we get started, let me give you my usual disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only. Please do not take what I say as fact. Please always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Next, if you have not liked, subscribed, or commented yet, please consider doing so because it really helps me out and I really appreciate it. Okay, so Joan and Philip Bates were your all-American family. They've been married for over 40 years at this point and had raised 3 amazing boys, Robert, Alan, and Kevin. Philip was an engineer, and him and Joan raised their family in Birmingham, Alabama for many years. Then in 1992, after 29 years at Bell South, Philip decided it was time to retire from the company and move his family to Marietta, which is located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Alan was an incredibly popular student at Shades Valley High School in Irondale, Alabama. So popular, in fact, that he was elected class president in grades 9, 10, and 11. In the summer of 1989, just before he was set to start his senior year, Alan would meet a girl by the name Jessica Callis. To be fair, Jessica didn't always have it so bad. And a girl by the name of Naomi, who had been friends with Jessica since middle school, would come out to say that Jessica had a pretty normal life then. She described her as incredibly intelligent, sweet, caring, and super outgoing. She only surrounded herself with people that truly cared about her, and she would only befriend people who were good role models. Jessica even started freshman year at Shades Valley as an honor student. But by the 10th grade, everything in Jessica's life had essentially gone to shit. She seemed to be living life on her own, and even though she was living with her mother and stepfather at the time, she was rarely home and thought nothing of jumping into her car and taking off for days at a time. When she was home, there would always be arguments, and they were usually between Jessica and her stepfather, Albert. Naomi recalls that Albert was always trying to get Jessica to do the right thing, but he couldn't make her. In fact, nobody could make Jessica do anything that she didn't want to. Oh God, that is just so true as the story goes on. The Bates family had a tradition of going to the Gulf Coast every summer. Philip would get the same condo every single year on the beach that he would rent from his friend. Alan told Jessica about the upcoming trip, and he told her the beach that they were going to, but he never gave her the address of the condo. He was excited about the family trip, feeling like it would be a great way for him to clear his head before the start of his senior year. Jessica told Alan not to worry about it, assuring him that they would just hook up after he returned from his vacation. So with that, the Bates family loaded up their van and they took off. The only difference this year was that Robert wouldn't be attending the family trip because he was settling into college. A couple days into the trip, early one morning, Alan and Kevin are standing on the balcony, just kind of looking out onto the beach while their parents were sleeping because it was very early. Kevin recalls that while they're standing there on the balcony, he notices his brother's eyes widen and like a look of shock come over his face. After he does a double take, he realizes that his eyes are not deceiving him and that it is indeed Jessica standing in front of him on the beach. After Alan and his family left, Jessica and her girlfriend jump into her car. They drive 260 miles, 8 hours round trip, down to the beach where she knew Alan was staying. They would then drive up and down the coastline until they spot the Bates van. Once they spot the van, the girls park and they camp out for the night on the beach in front of the condo. Guys, this should always be considered a red flag. Always. If a girl or a guy shows up uninvited somewhere like this, I would suggest you run, and you run fast. Especially after only knowing them 6 weeks. Alan, being the nice, sweet, caring guy that he was, felt flattered that this girl he barely knew traveled 4 hours to the beach where he was staying, then stalked his family's car for Lord knows how long, just so that she could see him. He was actually more shocked that her parents allowed their 16-year-old daughter to take off to the shore with her girlfriend without any adult supervision. So, Alan and Kevin walked down to the beach to greet them. Jessica and her girlfriend would spend the day with Alan and his family before heading back home that night, leaving Alan and his family to finish off their vacation. After Alan returns from the trip, he spent the remainder of the summer vacation hanging out with Jessica. One of their friends would recall that they almost broke up that summer, even though they weren't even actually dating at this point. The friend recalls that there was no way that Jessica was ever going to let Alan go. He was her golden ticket out of the miserable home life that she was living. And he was going to be the person that was going to give her the life that she had always wanted. It was also during this argument that Jessica would break the news to Alan that she was pregnant with his baby. This actually seemed incredibly odd to a lot of Alan's friends and even led them to question if Alan was really the father of the baby. Not to mention that this was just 6 weeks into their relationship. Yes, I know it only takes one time. I'm very well aware of that. But friends were questioning things. And you'll see as we go on, they probably had reasons to. Jessica had a way of getting boys by sex. And if she thought they were going to be able to provide for her financially, she would think nothing about getting pregnant. This is also somebody that has had at least 5 abortions under her belt. So there's that. Shocked, confused, and scared, Alan only shared this information with one person, his best friend, a girl by the name of Marley. A few days later, Alan overheard Marley talking to a mutual friend of theirs. She told the friend that Jessica had done this on purpose to trap him. She was probably right. Pissed off about what he heard, Alan confronts Marley. So here's the other thing. Jessica hated any relationship that Alan had, even the relationships that he had with his family. But she especially hated the friendships that he had with those of the opposite sex. So Alan would end that conversation by telling Marley that he thought that it would be best if they went their separate ways for a while. Ending the friendship amicably, but nevertheless still ending the friendship. Fall of senior year comes, and Alan's parents begin to become very worried about their son. They start to notice that he's become very withdrawn from them, and it's becoming a major concern. He begins walking around the house with his head slumped down. He begins backing off of his music, which was a huge passion for him. And he didn't run for class president, even though he had won it the past 3 years. Janet tells Philip to go have a talk with her son, because that's what good parents are supposed to do. Philip and Janet prided themselves on the fact that they had an open and honest dialogue with their children and reminded them constantly that they could come to them with any problems that they encounter, assuring their children that they will figure it out together as a family. When Philip approached Alan with his concerns, he told his father not to worry about it, that it was nothing big, and it was nothing that he couldn't figure out on his own. So Philip, although upset, he respected his son's wishes, because what else could he do? He couldn't make Alan tell him what was going on. And that's a lesson that I'm slowly starting to learn with my daughter, and it's no fun. Actually, it sucks. It sucks. But because this isn't the type of secret that could be kept quiet for long, Alan would eventually have to come clean to his parents. So he decides to do this by writing them a letter and leaving it on his father's desk. As Philip reads the letter, he's disappointed in the carelessness of Alan and Jessica, but he's proud of the fact that he raised a son with enough morals to do the right thing. Joan was incredibly upset about the news, and Jessica was not the woman that she wanted to be the mother of her grandchildren, and she questioned if her son was really the father. But she knew that there wasn't much that she could do about it at this point, except for to support her son, so that's what she did. The letter went on to say that although he was going to take full responsibility for the baby, this in no way meant that he was going to quit school, give up on his dreams of working as a technical director or stagehand on Broadway, or give up his love of music. Jessica, on the other hand, would end up quitting school and moving into the Bates family home while she waited for the baby to arrive. When Jessica told Naomi about the baby, she questioned why she decided to keep this baby but chose to abort the other ones. Jessica told Naomi that she and Alan were getting married, although her reasons behind the marriage were not your traditional ones. Naomi claims that Jessica told her the only reason she was marrying Alan was because Alan's grandfather agreed to pay for Jessica to have the baby at Brookwood Hospital. So apparently, if you don't have insurance, there are specific hospitals that women can go to have their babies. Brookwood Hospital was a private hospital, and Alan's grandfather was willing to pick up the hospital bill, but only if the two were married. After Jessica moved in, the members of the Bates family began to ask themselves who Jessica was. They barely knew this girl, and now she was going to be part of their everyday life and the mother to their son, brother's baby. It wasn't hard for them to see why she would be attracted to Alan. Alan was the type of guy that any mother would love for their daughter to walk into the house with. He was an honor student, class president, 3 years in a row, an active member of the church, and he played the drums in various bands, including Christian ones. During high school, he would pick up an interest in theater, and it would soon become one of his greatest passions. Jessica, on the other hand, was the oldest of 3 siblings, and she would tell stories about when her mother and father were married, claiming that before her mother Diane divorced her father George, The two would have daily and often violent arguments that included DV on her father's part. Jessica claimed that when her father walked out on the family, he took all of the pictures and burned them. And this is the only reason why Jessica doesn't have any family pictures. Kevin Bates, so Alan's little brother, would later come out to say that it wasn't until later on that the family began to question all of the stories being told to them by Jessica. Some of the family members believe the stories told by Jessica were done on purpose as a way to gain sympathy from the Bates family and to make Alan fall even deeper in love with her. While Jessica stayed at the Bates home with her growing belly, family began to question all of the stories being told to them by Jessica. Some of the family members believe the stories told by Jessica were done on purpose as a way to gain sympathy from the Bates family and to make Alan fall even deeper in love with her. January 26, 1990, Alan and Jessica get married. March 20th, 1990, they welcome their first child, a little girl that they name Samantha. The day of Samantha's birth, Jessica's mom, Diane, along with Joan and Philip Bates, Alan's brothers, Robert and Kevin, are all in attendance. The two families hadn't seen each other since the wedding, and they were still getting to know each other. Jessica's stepfather, Albert, he was a handyman that owned a small business, and he even offered Alan side jobs if he ever needed to make some extra cash. So I feel like that's at least, I mean, they're trying. I have to give it to them. At least they're trying. I don't know what I would do. Imagine your two teens, they only knew each other 6 weeks. Now this chick is living with you. You think she's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Your son has married her. There's a granddaughter. That's a lot. Alan was determined to do whatever he had to do in order to give Jessica and Samantha the life that they deserved. And Jessica was determined to give Samantha everything she never had growing up. I'm going to say allegedly on this one. Because I personally think that Jessica is a shitbag of a mom. April 1990, a month after Samantha was born, Alan and Jessica decide to move into Jessica's mother's home in Hoover, Alabama. Alan enrolls in the University of Montevallo, and it would become more convenient for Alan's work and school responsibilities. Plus, they would have a built-in babysitter with Diane. The move to Jessica's mother's house would only last a month before a huge fight happens and Jessica, Alan, and Samantha move back to the Bates home. Whatever the argument, it must have been explosive because Jessica even pulls Joan aside one day to tell her that if her mother ever calls, not to let her over to see the baby, telling her that she's the only one that's allowed to decide when her mother is allowed to see her baby. Robert Bates, being an outsider in all of this, in this whole situation, he saw things in Jessica that the rest of the family didn't pick up on. And I guess this would make sense because Robert was the only family member that never lived with her. And it's later explained as Jessica having like a hidden rage inside her soul that came out slowly the more comfortable she became in her role as Mrs. Alan Bates. Shortly after they moved back into the Bates home, Philip purchases the couple a really small fixer-upper that's located close to Alan's college. And even though the home needed a lot of TLC, there was enough room for the three of them, and it was the perfect starter home. Jessica was extremely excited about this because it was the perfect way for her to isolate Alan from his family and friends. She hated any relationship that Alan had in his life, and she did her best to destroy as many of them as possible. At this point, Jessica was sitting home, being lazy, and doing the absolute bare minimum for Samantha. Alan, on the other hand, was working his ass off, playing in a gospel band, going to school, and working side hustles to make extra money for his family. Instead of being grateful for everything that her new husband was doing for his family, her jealousy would consume her. She even shows up at Alan's college one day with the baby, finds him in the production room, and begins screaming at him in front of everybody, accusing him of having sex with other women. Alan is eventually able to pull her aside, calm her down, and send her on her way, but the embarrassment of that day would be long-lasting for sure. November 11th, 1992, any doubts planted in the minds of Alan's friends and family about Jessica's past would be put to rest. Her father, George Callis, calls 911 asking for paramedics. When the operator asks what's going on, he very calmly, very matter-of-factly tells her that he has been beating his wife all day and she has stopped breathing. George is found guilty of and sentenced to life in prison. November 16th, 1992, Jessica gives birth to the couple's second child, a little girl that they named McKenna. Instead of things calming down at this point, her obsessiveness goes into overdrive. And by the end of 1993, the relationship between Alan and Jessica was declining at a rapid pace. Alan would spend a number of nights sleeping on a cot at the university just to avoid having to go home to see Jessica. He would confide in friends that every time he and Jessica spoke, there was some sort of argument and he just couldn't take it anymore. December 1993, Jessica decides to get her GED just like she promised herself. Then, in the beginning of 1994, Jessica begins taking classes at Montevallo College. She was tired of sitting home, taking care of her children, and wanted something to fall back on if Alan ever decided to leave her. Spoiler alert, he does. Jessica began telling anyone that would listen that Alan was hitting her, that he would scream at her and the kids, and they no longer got along sexually. Alan, on the other hand, was still determined to make his marriage work because he believed in his vows, and he figured if it's just arguments and stuff, like, he was willing to work through that. By February of 1994, Alan was working 2 jobs. He was taking care of the couple's 2 daughters. He was going to class, and he was studying, while Jessica was going out at night and taking one class, a history class, that was around 3 hours a week, including study time. Not long into Jessica's history course, she came home and told Alan that she was going to Washington, D.C. for the weekend for a class project. Alan was actually very supportive of this, and he was happy for Jessica that she was finally making friends and getting out. While in D.C., Alan is home watching the girls, and he's rummaging through the drawers when he notices that things are missing. As in lingerie, things are missing. And he comes across a man's phone number. He calls the phone number and a woman answers. It's the man's mother. The mother tells Alan that her son is in Washington, D.C. for the weekend, and that's when it clicks. He phones Jessica at the hotel, and the two have a massive blowout. Alan has put up with so much shit from Jessica, but an affair is the absolute last draw for him. He asks his family to watch the girls, and he begins packing up his belongings. While he's packing up, Jessica comes home. He tells her that he's done with the marriage and that it's over and that she just went too far this time. Side note, she went too far years ago, my friend. And I'm actually just sad that it took him this long to realize it. But the following morning, Alan would confide in his brothers that when he told Jessica it was over, she calmly walked into the kitchen. She grabbed a butcher knife and she chased him with it. Alan literally got out of the house by the skin of his teeth, closing the tip of the knife in the front door as he slammed it shut. It was truly over now. The following morning, Alan, his father, and his brother go over to the house to collect any belongings that were left behind. When they get there, they said that the house was trashed. Any pictures were ripped into pieces, and all of Alan's belongings had been smashed with a hammer. In Jessica's mind, Alan was leaving her, and this meant war. From the moment Alan walked out of the house that day, Jessica began to alienate him from his children. As far as she was concerned, Alan abandoned his family, and because of this, he didn't deserve to see his children. This is the single most immature and selfish thing that you can do as a parent. Your aim is to hurt the father or the mother of your children by keeping them away from each other. But in truth, the people you're actually hurting are your children. This is my take. This will always be my take. Unless there is a major and concrete safety reason for you to keep your children away from a parent, this should never be done. It's not about you and your butthurt feelings. It's about the children. I promise you, I know how this feels. I've had to put my pride aside so many times. I've had to put my feelings aside so many times. At the end of the day, it is not about me. Unless you have, listen, if you have concrete reasons to be keeping your kids away from their mother or their father, do it. Other than that, don't ever do this. That's my PSA for the day. Jessica would begin to tell the children, and really anybody else that would listen, that Alan wasn't paying her child support for the children and that he didn't want to see the children. Going so far as to claim in court that she had to move back home with her mother and stepfather because she couldn't afford heat. The truth of the matter is that Alan was paying his child support before he was even required to do so by the courts, and there were receipts to prove this. Sometimes he even paid more than required. Alan and Jessica's divorce would be finalized in January of 1995. Alan was confident that Jessica would be able to snap out of her immature antics, eventually become a mature adult, realize that the relationship moving forward was solely about raising the girls, and eventually accept it. He could not have been more wrong. As soon as the judge slammed down that gavel, Jessica made Alan's life a hell that he never knew possible. She began to routinely keep the kids away from Alan, only allowing him to see them when she wanted him to, despite what the court-ordered agreement stated. He would call and leave messages for the girls that were never returned. And then when he finally would see the girls, he would ask them if mommy or grandma ever gave them the messages, and they would say no. Jessica would make the girls sit outside on the porch for hours, telling them that their father was coming, even though she knew it wasn't his day, and therefore he had no plans of going there to get them. She would come out after several hours and tell the girls, "See, I told you your father didn't love you." That's terrible. That is just, you are fucking garbage. You are such garbage for that. Such garbage. By the end of 1995, Alan realized that Jessica was taking his child support checks and spending them on herself, all while telling the children that she couldn't get them things because their father wasn't paying his child support. It was at that point that Alan decided to keep a detailed record of everything in his life. He would meticulously record every missed visitation, harassing voicemail, and file them in a box that he labeled evidence. He would also decide to begin to focus on the things that Jessica couldn't control in his life. He graduated from the University of Montevallo. He got his first real job in the theater as a stage manager, and he fell in love with a woman named Tara Klug. While Alan was working at the Alabama Theater as a stage manager, Tara was hired there as well. She was hired to help restore the theater. Tara was born and raised in North Carolina, and she got her degree in art history. Tara, who was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, quit her job after the theater's restoration was over and stayed in Birmingham to continue her relationship with Alan. Alan enjoyed finally being in a mature relationship. They respected each other, cared how the other one felt, and talked through their issues like adults. The one person that absolutely despised the fact that Alan and Tara were in a happy and healthy relationship, of course, was Jessica. And knowing what we know about Jessica, it should come as no surprise to any of us that she was not going to sit back and let this couple live happily ever after. Her first order of business? Find another man, of course. So she begins hanging out at a comic book store called the Lion and Unicorn Comics and Games Card Store. Jessica didn't begin hanging out at this store because she had a genuine interest in comics. The reason she began hanging out there was for the man behind the counter, a man by the name of Brad. Jessica and Brad would become friends, and he would even end up getting her a job at the comic book store. By New Year's of 1996, Brad and Jessica had begun dating. Friends would later say that Jessica wasn't dating him because she was genuinely interested in him. She was dating him because she believed that he was going to come into a large sum of money at some point. She told Brad that she was married once but divorced several years ago. She never told Brad about her children because she heard that Brad didn't like kids, and that's going to be an issue, right? So she decides to continue to date him and hide her children. Jessica even moves in with Brad and still doesn't tell him about the girls. In fact, it wasn't until 6 weeks after they were living together that she would finally come clean to Brad about the girls, telling him that they've been living with her mother this whole time, that they needed their mom because their father was not in their life. If that's not the sickest and most twisted that you have ever heard. Meanwhile, if you don't want your kids around because you want to trap a guy, which is ridiculous to begin with, but listen, do you? If that's what you want, why wouldn't you give them to their father in the meantime while you're trapping this dude? It's ridiculous. Give the girls to their dad if you don't want them around. Okay. It was also around this time that she would tell Brad that she was pregnant. Remember, Brad wants nothing to do with being a father. So he tells her he doesn't want it. Jessica tells him that she's not going to abort the baby, and she refuses to have strangers raising her baby. Side note, no doctors in Birmingham would perform abortions for Jessica because she had so many of them. So if she needed or wanted to have another abortion, she would actually have to travel out of state to do so. I'm going to give you another PSA for the day. Look, this story is jam-packed with them. Abortions are not a form of birth control. Don't do that. Don't do that. Ever. Okay? An abortion is not a form of birth control. Listen, and I'm pro-choice. I am. I'm pro-choice. I think that it's a woman's body. I think that she has the right to make a decision. If something tragic happens, if you make a mistake, I don't look at you differently. I just don't. I don't think it's any of my business. I think it's your body. But when we're going 5, 6, 7, it's not mistakes anymore. Don't do that. Brad would later say in court that Jessica put that baby up for adoption. Then about 6 months after this, Jessica would go to Brad again and tell him that she was pregnant again. So this obviously led to major problems in the couple's relationship, and the two would end up splitting. I'm not even really sure that this bothered Jessica that much because she was now receiving child support checks from Brad for the new baby. So by the spring of 1997, Jessica was living at her mom's house and she was collecting $1,200 a month in child support between Alan and Brad. In 1997. Do you know, in 2024, with 2 kids, I don't get close to this. Not close to it. Nowhere near it. I would end up being able to prove to the courts that he couldn't swing $800 a month and was able to knock off a little over $400 a month from his child support payment, which is still a lot of money, considering I get about that for 2. When it came time to discuss visitations for his child, Brad told the courts that he didn't want visitations with Jessica because he feared for his life. Okay, I know that sounds like a shitty excuse, especially coming from a dad that didn't want to be a dad to begin with, right? Yes, I know. But this was actually not the case. Brad was legitimately fearful for his life when it came to Jessica. This is why. He heard from his lawyer about an incident that occurred between Jessica and Alan during a drop-off. Jessica shows up to Alan's apartment to drop the girls off, and she decides to start a huge fight. She would hit Alan, scratch Alan, and push him down the stairs before leaving the apartment. Instead of leaving, she stands outside and she waits for police to arrive. Then when the police show up, Jessica shows them scratches and tells them that Alan did it. One officer take a closer look. I can't. I just can't with this. I can't. When they take a closer look, they realize that the scratches are more like self-inflicted scratches from a piece of concrete or brick, rather than scratches that were done from a person. Because, look, you don't have to be the smartest person in the world to know that scratching yourself on a brick and scratches from a human look completely different. They do not look the same. Alan, on the other hand, had deep scratches on his face and broke his arm when he got pushed down the steps. So there's that. The story would also be corroborated by Alan's mother and Alan's friend, who were present at the time. Also during this time that Jessica had begun working for Birmingham Police Department as a clerical secretary. But a combination between Jessica being lazy, a lazy sack of shit, and her attack on Alan would force the department to just let her go. But not before she met and started dating Birmingham police officer Jeff McCord. Growing up, Jeff loved football. He graduated from the University of Montevideo, and his family and friends were incredibly proud of him, expecting him to do great things with his life. Even Alan was happy about Jessica dating Jeff because he felt as though his girls would be much safer with a police officer around. Another one of Jessica's antics was that she would take the girls and she would hide the girls at people's homes on Alan's scheduled visits so that he wouldn't be able to find them. Naomi tells a story about how her and her husband are sitting down eating dinner one night when Jessica and the girls show up uninvited and stay for hours. This completely confused Naomi at first, but after they left, it clicked. She was hiding the girls from Alan. Alan and Tara had planned to wed in June of 1999. They were going to have the wedding on the stage of the Alabama Theater where they met, which is so incredibly cute and romantic. They had their invitations made, hired the caterer, purchased flowers, tuxedos, and dresses for Tara and the girls. But Jessica was not going to let this marriage happen, not on her watch. She began hiding those girls a week before Alan's wedding. No daughters, no wedding. Tara understood how important it was for Alan to have his girls at the wedding, and she agreed to postpone it. Not only was it incredibly important for Alan to have his girls at his wedding, but he also refused to give Jessica another thing to brainwash the girls with. See, your father doesn't love you. I told you your father doesn't love you. He went off and got married and he didn't even have you girls there. See, I told you he didn't love you. That type of thing. In June of 1999, Alan was forced to file a grievance against Jessica for not following the final judgment of the divorce. It didn't end there though, because after this filing, Alan's lawyer would have to submit several more to the court. April 4th, 2000, the court case arrives. Jessica decides to not even show up for the hearing, which prompts her lawyer to tell the judge that he is dropping Jessica as a client. The judge agrees, and then this actually ends up giving Alan and his lawyer a chance to be able to present their case to the judge much easier. The judge would end up finding Jessica in contempt of court and sentence her to 10 days in jail, which would be suspended until the October hearing. So it's actually pretty simple. If she follows the guidelines, she doesn't go to jail. If she doesn't, they lock her ass up. It's very cut and dry. The original custody agreement states that Alan can have the kids for 8 weeks in the summer as long as he gives 30 days notice. So Alan has his lawyer send Jessica a letter requesting the girls from June 19th, 2000 through August 13th of 2000. And to Alan's surprise, she agrees. So June 24th of 2000, Alan and Tara are finally able to wed after almost a full year. They ended up getting married at the Alabama Theater with Alan's girls in attendance. After the wedding was over, the girls went to Alan's mother's for a few days so that the newlyweds could have like a small honeymoon. And then when they returned, Alan and Tara took the girls to their new house in Maryland, and they finished out their vacation together. After the vacation is over, Jessica goes right back to keeping the kids from Alan. So basically any hope that Alan had of Jessica acting like a mature adult was pretty much demolished almost immediately. Even worse, because Alan and Tara were living in Maryland, the only thing Jessica would have to do to be following the court's orders is to allow him to talk to the girls for 15 minutes a week. This is literally the easiest task in the world. But could Jessica do it? Nope. Dumbass. Dumb. Come October, Jessica fails to show up to the court case once again. and the judge orders her to spend 10 days in prison, as he should. When Jessica gets word of this, she explodes and she begins blaming Alan for putting her in jail. Obviously, Alan is not the one that put Jessica in jail. Jessica did this to herself. And the judge is the person that signed off on it. But instead of taking responsibility for her multiple fuck-ups, Jessica decides it would be a much better idea to go into hiding with Jeff and the girls. She makes Jeff remove the mailbox from the house so that he couldn't receive any more legal papers. She removes the girls from school and starts homeschooling them. The hearings would go on to be postponed in May, then again in July, and then again in September, because in September, Jessica gave birth to her 4th child. December 18th, 2001, Jessica and Jeff are home when they get a knock on the door from police with a warrant to bring Jessica to jail for her 10-day sentence. Because if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. So, Jessica actually initially tells police that she's not Jessica. She claims to be her sister, which it's stupid in general, but police say, okay, so they call dispatch for a photo of her. And that's when she decides to come clean and tell police that she's indeed Jessica. But then she goes so far as to blame her daughter for giving her the idea to say that she was her sister. A few days into her sentence, Jeff and Diane get in touch with Alan, and they basically ask Alan if he will let Jessica out for 2 days so that he could spend Christmas with the girls. The courts agreed to allow this just as long as Alan signs off of it. So, without hesitation, Alan signs. Because once again, this was never about punishing Jessica. It was always about seeing his girls. Alan's granted temporary custody of the girls while Jessica's in jail, and he would eventually be forced to seek full custody because of Jessica's bullshit. January 14th, 2002, the judge gave the girls back to Jessica until the court case is settled. Depositions were set to begin on February 15th, 2002. The day before, Alan flew from his home in Frederick, Maryland to Birmingham, Alabama, so he could speak in the child custody case. This is not the actual trial. The actual trial is scheduled for March 5th of 2002. This is just a chance for Alan and Jessica to tell their version of events. So the plan is that after the deposition is over, Alan, Tara, and the girls would drive to Joan and Philip's home to spend the weekend with them. So as time goes on, it's getting later and later, and Joan and Philip are waiting. So at first, Joan thinks that maybe Jessica changed her mind and she's given Alan trouble to take the girls. So she sits and she waits and she waits and she waits. Because it's about a 2-hour drive from Birmingham to Marietta, Alan was expected to arrive at Joan and Philip's home around 9:30 p.m. and Joan had dinner waiting for them. Alan would always call when he was on his way, but he didn't call this time. So they tried to not freak out at first because his not calling could really be attributed to anything at this point, right? Around 10:30, Joan begins to become increasingly concerned. Philip assures her that they probably hit traffic and that everything is fine. But Joan knew something was wrong because a mother always knows when something is wrong with her babies. So Philip says, okay. He tries to put Joan's mind at ease and he begins to make phone calls. He calls Alan's phone, nothing. He calls Tara's phone, nothing. So he takes a deep breath and he calls Jessica's phone, nothing. That's when he calls the Pelham Police Department where Jeff worked, knowing that he was scheduled to work that night. Dispatch tells Philip that Jeff had actually taken off that evening. So that's when they decide that this is no longer an assumption and they phone Hoover Police Department. Philip first asks if there has been anything reported at Jessica and Jeff's address. So when dispatch tells him no, he asks for a wellness check to be done. So of course police agree and they plan to get back to him with what their officer finds. Okay, so when the officer arrives at the home, he grabs his flashlight and he walks up to the front door. He says that all the windows were covered with either like towels or sheets. I almost said shallows. Towels or sheets from the inside. And it seems to him that there's some kind of construction going on in the home. Decides to walk around to the back of the house where he finds a handmade sign on a piece of cardboard that says, "We're having some problems with our front door. Please come around to the back door." Okay, no biggie, right? He knocks on the door, nothing. But keep in mind that this is 12:21 in the morning. So to assume that the family is sleeping and Alan and Tara are somewhere else wouldn't be completely far-fetched. He checks a few more windows, but every single window is covered from the inside. He goes back to his car and he calls dispatch to say that nobody answered, but the home looked as though it was fine from the outside. Then around 3:30 in the morning, the same evening, 4 friends are driving through Rutledge, Georgia on their way to South Carolina when they see a huge fire in the distance. Concerned that the woods might be on fire, they immediately call 911. When firefighters arrive, they realize that it's actually a car that has been set ablaze. Once the fire is put out, officers smell the unmistakable smell of burning flesh. When they pop the trunk, they find the charred bodies of 2 individuals. One is clearly a male, and the other is either a child or a very small woman. But because the car is so badly destroyed, they wouldn't be able to get much, if any, information from it. Luckily, the license plate was still intact, and that was really the only way that officers were able to identify the car. Meanwhile, back at the Bates home, Joan and Philip are still pacing the floors. Philip decides to start making phone calls to car rental places. He calls Avis first and explains his story, asking if they rented a car to either Alan or Tara Bates. The person on the other line says, "Hold on," and then the supervisor comes to the phone and he tells Philip that he was instructed to forward anybody calling about this rental to this phone number. A phone number that belonged to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And Philip says that's what he knew. Authorities start with Jeff McCord, believing that because he was a fellow officer, he would be the best way to track down Jessica. Jessica and Jeff's story for the night of Friday, February 15th, was that they went to dinner, they went to the movies to watch Lord of the Rings, they went to Home Depot, then they drove around where Jessica grew up, claiming that this was a late Valentine's Day date night. But when Jessica and Jeff's stories varied, police got suspicious. Most notably, Jeff said Alan was supposed to pick the girls up from his house, while Jessica said he was supposed to pick them up at her mother's house, saying that Alan wasn't allowed at her home and that he had never been there. During this interview, dental records would end up confirming the people in the trunk were Alan and Tara. An autopsy would determine that both of them were shot 4 times each. When officers asked Jessica if they could search the home, she says absolutely not. which is very strange because if you have nothing to hide, why wouldn't you let them in the house? Like, why wouldn't you try to do anything that you could to help find the father of your children? So, police decide to put the house under 24-hour surveillance. And that's when they spot Jessica's stepfather putting a couch in his car and then driving around with it all day long before putting it in a dumpster. Okay, so here's the other thing. Once you dispose of something, it becomes free range. Anybody can take it. So police grab the couch and they take it as evidence. Dumbass. The back of the couch and the cushions were gone, but they were able to find bloodstains on the couch. Then after this, it was fairly easy for them to get a search warrant for the home. When officers execute the search warrant for Jessica and Jeff's home, they find even more damning evidence. There was blood on the carpet and there was a bullet hole in the wall. Jeff and Jessica actually, because when they got home, I forgot to say this. When Jessica and Jeff got home that following morning, they tried to do like a deep clean, but they missed a lot. Part of their cleaning was they repapered the walls, but they never bothered to spackle the holes. So when police pulled down the wallpaper, they found a hole with a bullet in it. The bullet found in the wall matched a bullet that was found in Alan's wrist. They also found blood on a coffee table and paper towels inside the home that matched the print to paper towels found inside the burnt car. It's a wrap. It's all she wrote. Now it's time to secure the arrest warrant. Jeff and Jessica were hiding out at this time, but luckily there was a family member keeping track of them that was ready to throw them under the bus at a moment's notice. So, February 21st, 2002, Jeff and Jessica are arrested while at a friend's house. February 11th, 2003, Jessica's trial begins. Because Jeff refused to testify against Jessica, and because there was no witness, the state had to prove their case based off of circumstantial evidence. They believe that when Alan and Tara arrived to pick up the kids, they obviously saw the sign. They went around the back of the house. We know that all of this went down inside the home. Prosecutors don't know exactly who pulled the trigger, but it is very much believed that Jeff is the one that did it and Jessica's the one that orchestrated it. From there, they loaded the two into the car and they drove them 200 miles. They parked the car and they torched it. February 21st, 2003, Jessica is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In April of 2003, Jeff is sentenced to 2 life terms with the possibility of parole. All right, guys, if you're still here, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you and I appreciate you so, so, so very much. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you haven't yet. And until next time, stay safe out there.